Hello, and welcome to the Rossaround Backstage Podcast, talking with artists, technicians, musicians, producers, directors, and all the interesting and talented people that make it all happen for you. Hi, and welcome to the Rossaround Backstage Podcast. This is Ross Pallone, where we are going to focus on people that make things happen for you in the entertainment business. I'll be interviewing technicians, mixers, producers, directors, musicians, actors, and anybody else that goes into the art of entertainment. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and then every other week I'll be bringing you a new podcast with one of my friends or acquaintances that I've met along the road over my 41 years in the professional audio business. I'm going to tell you now a little story about myself, so that from now and on in the future, as you listen to these podcasts, you'll know who I am and what my background is. When I was a young boy, I wanted to be a drummer, and I was. My parents very thankfully gave me drum lessons. My mom bought me my very first drum set, and I just loved the whole idea of being in the music business. My sister, Ginny Pallone, was a very successful singer. She worked in Las Vegas for many, many years at all the big shows when they still had the big, like, Paris-type extravaganza shows. And she made a couple records, and she's retired now from that and is a real estate agent up in Vegas. But her influence on me, it just got me excited about the whole thing. I remember when I was around 13, and my sister was working at a club in Hollywood called the Red Velvet Club. And that club produced many big artists that went on to do big things. The Righteous Brothers got their start there, and a band called the Knickerbockers that had a big hit back in the 60s called Lies. Well, when I was around 13, my sister arranged for me and my parents to come down to the club and see her sing and to see the Knickerbockers play. And I remember I got to sit in the very front row, right in front of the drummer, and I was in awe, and I was hooked. From that moment on, I wanted to be a drummer. So after being just blown away by this, I practiced my drum set, just loved the whole thing, and wanted to join a band. When I was in junior high, back in those days, 9th grade was still junior high, got a call from a friend of mine, a schoolmate, Larry Thomas, that wanted me to come and join their band. And we played all cover music, mostly Beatles, anything that was popular at the time, Dave Clark 5 songs, any of that kind of stuff. And our first gig was the Teenage Fair. And, oh man, did I think that I was on top of the world. Playing the Teenage Fair in front of an audience. That day that we went down there to the Teenage Fair, we were only like 14, we saw Alice Cooper. He was the headliner playing in the afternoon in the inside part of the Hollywood Palladium. That's where the Teenage Fair used to be. So anyway, on through high school, Larry and I and the New Creation was the name of the band. We went on to play parties, high school dances, anywhere we could play. And we just had quite a blast with that. And then after high school, Larry and I, we formed another band. It was just a trio. It was just him playing keyboards and key bass, and a girl singer who played guitar. And we cleaned up with that band. We did parties, weddings, played in a nightclub, nearby our home. Had a lot of fun with that. I played in several other different kinds of bands, cover bands, some original bands. And eventually, I just got tired of the whole thing because it wasn't going anywhere. Well, I remember sitting at a friend of mine's apartment, and we were listening to Boz Scaggs' Silk Degrees, and I just thought, man, God, that record sounds so great to me. And I thought, I wonder how that happens. And so I got inspired, and I found out that one of my schoolmates, Bill Bottrell, who eventually went on to be the engineer and producer on the Tuesday Night Club with Sheryl Crow, and he invited me over to the studio that he was working at called California Recorders. And he showed me around that studio, and I just thought, man, I've gone to heaven now. This is the greatest thing. I want to do this. So in order to fill that wish of mine, I decided to check into it. I went to 2 schools for recording engineers. One was called the Dick Grove Music Workshop, and the other one was called the University of Sound Arts, where I learned very little. But, they try to tell you that you've learned a lot. So anyway, after doing that, I made up a little resume, and I decided I'm going to go out. I went and I walked around Hollywood all day long, and I dropped off my resume, and I visited all the studios in the Hollywood area. I walked into a place called the Hollywood Sound Recorders, which was on Selma, and that was smack dab right in between Sound Factory and Wally Heider's. And so these 3 studios were some of the top-notch studios in the world. And Hollywood Sound, they said, yeah, come on in, we can use you. And so they put me to work being the night guy, answering the phones, going and getting food, basically a runner, putting away mic cables, organizing tape blockers and all that sort of stuff. They eventually started letting me sit in on sessions. Once they felt confident, then they allowed me to be the assistant engineer on projects. And then when anyone would come into the studio that didn't have an engineer, which was kind of rare at the time, they would allow me to be the first engineer. And a lot of these were, low-budget, independent things. And that's where I met my good friend, even to today, Chris Palonis. P-E-L-O-N-I-S is not the same as my name. Chris, he wanted to record songs. And so he had money to pay, and we recorded a lot of material for Chris. And Chris and I became good friends. We're still good friends today. And now Chris is a very successful producer and engineer himself. And he owns Palonis Sound and Acoustics, which designs studios. So anyway, along those lines, working at Hollywood Sound Recorders, I was honored and so blessed to get to work with all kinds of great engineers. Among them, George Massenburg, who did Earth, Wind, and Fire there before Earth, Wind, and Fire eventually ended up building their own studio. But I got to work hand in hand with George Massenburg, Tom Perry, John Gass, Rick Picconen, to name a few of the great and talented engineers that came through that studio. And I was dedicated to learning from these guys. Every day after the sessions, I'd make notes to myself. I would walk around the studio. I'd look to see how everything was mic'd, how they EQ'd things, and just everything. And this was a great time for me. I eventually became very friendly with Tom Perry, who used me as his assistant engineer a lot back then. And Tom, he got hired to do a record. It was Amy Holland's second solo record. Amy Holland is the wife of Michael McDonald. And Michael was producing this record for Amy. And I was working as the assistant with Tom. And eventually Tom had to leave the project, I think, to go work with Earth, Wind, and Fire. And so when he left, they turned the project over to me. And I became the first engineer on that project and finished it with Michael. And that was my first really big, major label record that I got to be the engineer on. After that record was done, Michael and I had hit it off real well, and we decided that, he decided to invite me over to his house. He had a small studio at his house. He had a 24-track analog machine and an API console, and so we started working on demos for his second solo album, which eventually became the Masters, and I ended up doing that entire record with him. It's called No Looking Back. And so I did that record, which was my second big record. It was the first one I had ever completed on my own. We also did a record with his sister, Maureen McDonald, with her band called Delta. And then I had never done any live sound at this time. And when Michael's record came out, the record company, of course, wanted him to go on tour, in support of the new record. So Michael asked me to go out and be his live sound engineer, the front of house mixer. Well, I had never done this before. So Michael had a long-time relationship with Dirk Schubert, the owner of Schubert Systems Group. So when we went out on tour, that was the sound company we hired, and Dirk came out to our first show. I can't remember. It was somewhere local. It was somewhere in Southern California. And that first day, Dirk gave me my first full day lesson in being a live mixer. And I appreciate that till today. And he showed me what to do, what not to do, showed me how to get the day started, gave me all these pointers and tips, which I really appreciate. Dirk is a very, very great guy and a wonderful mixer himself. By the way, his company, Schubert System Group, is still in existence, and they mostly support touring acts. It's a great company. So after that, then, being a sound engineer, a live sound engineer, and a recording engineer. So now I got both things I can do, which was really nice because I probably, over all the years until the big music business crash, I probably made about 75% of my income from studio work and about 25% from live. Back in those days, I used to do records, film, TV, jingles, all kinds of everything. We were always busy and a lot of fun getting to work in the studio with all these great people. I worked with all the Toto guys and countless other acts. By the way, if you'd like to see a complete list of what I have done in the recording studios, all you need to do is Google my name, Ross Pallone. That's with 2 L's. Or you can go to my website, which is rosspallone.com. And you can see all the records that I worked on back in those days. It was quite a time. So working with Michael McDonald, eventually I got introduced to John Tesh, who had just moved out from New York to be on a television show. I can't even remember the name of it. It's still on TV now. But anyway, John Tesh had always been interested in music too, and he used to do the music for the big bicycle race in France. And he had done that and got a lot of accolades for that. But John, when he moved to California, besides doing a television show, he wanted to make and produce his own records. So I started working with John and at the same time working with Michael. And eventually, Michael had a period of time there before he had done the Motown series of records where he really wasn't touring that much and really wasn't doing that much. And John was going gangbusters. We were doing concerts all the time. We were producing records. John made me co-producer on a bunch of records that his own label created. Those were some great times. So eventually I had to make the choice because I was starting to get conflicts between my shows with Michael and the shows with John. And it was kind of a no-brainer because I was just making way more money with John. So I left the touring with Michael and went whole hog in with John, doing records, doing live shows. We did a PBS special called Live at Red Rocks, which was a huge endeavor. I was nominated for an Emmy Award, didn't win, but that was in 1994 to 1995. I co-produced a bunch of records on John's label with Charlie Bisharat, and the last record that I did with him was co-produced with Tim Landers, and that record was John's first Christian record. John decided to go into the Christian record business, and I did that record, and then shortly after that came the big economic crash after 9/11, where not only did we have the problems with the 9/11 economy, but we also suffered the crash of the music business. Napster came into view. Record companies just they just went nuts. They just